So you're very, very good. You've sort of accidentally become an interpreter of all of this data. Do you think we're getting the truth from governments like that in the UK and your home country of the Republic of Ireland?
Well, the truth is in the eye of the beholder. I guess many of them believe that they're, giving truth, but I wouldn't agree with their interpretations, is probably the way I'd say it. The cases have been rising. The test frequency has gone up a factor of 20 since April. The cases have gone through the roof, but that's very misleading because they're PCR positives. They can have many false positives. Most are asymptomatic, and they're being called cases, which really the definition should be someone who's hospitalized or very significant symptoms, but overwhelmingly they're not. And they're even being called COVID, which is the full disease process coming from the virus. But again, we got to remember they're just PCR positives with a high false positive rate. So that's just really misleading. And the UK mortality is currently under 1 per million people in the UK per day, which is very low. And it looks like the all-cause mortality from respiratory in general for the UK is not even off historical averages at the moment. So the real impacts are not really there to justify significant measures curtailing freedoms and curtailing businesses. It just doesn't seem justified at all.
Have so many governments globally focused on the wrong target, the wrong enemy, which is the R rate, the rate of infection?
Yeah, at this point in the game, if you will, the R rate is not really the thing to focus on. So maybe in a rising epidemic like back in March, certainly something to be tracked. But right now it should be ICU on vent with COVID and general capacity loading and certainly mortality. Because when we're at a much lower level and the first wave of a new virus, which is always quite severe, but then following that, we shouldn't expect a major second wave at all by the science. So when you're in a kind of just the season coming into winter and you're seeing more respiratory issues, you should be tracking the real impacts, the ICU and the mortality, not the R rate.
Like many high profile lockdown critics, you yourself and I here on this show, Ivor, are happy to cut governments a bit of slack in relation to lockdown measures in March, just based upon the fact that it was a bit of an unknown quantity and it was probably worth a punt to slow down the spread of the virus in those early weeks. However, things have changed. Here we are now in October with a similar attachment to this idea that lockdowns work. With the gift of hindsight, what is now the news on whether those early lockdowns in the spring were effective?
Right. Well, the lockdowns, there's really been solid guidelines for decades on pandemics. They certainly don't include lockdowns or quarantine. So that was a new thing in March 2020, which, to be quite honest, seems to have been leveraged from China all of a sudden. So very unusual. But like you say, when we're heading into an unknown, you're going to throw everything at it. So it's a precautionary principle. But as soon as we realized the curve was turning, which was early April in the UK and much of Europe, and coming down, that's when the lockdown should have been taken away rapidly because they're an untested technology anyway. Now, luckily in April and May, based on the actual data, not modeling, many papers were published which showed that lockdown had a minimal effect, if anything. So the cost benefit of lockdown was absurdly poor. So we got that information, and it just seems that the system is highly resistant to acknowledging that. Lockdowns never really had any proof after the fact when the analysis was done. And now we're still talking lockdowns when our impact levels are relatively tiny and rising slowly. So one other thing I did today was looked at Spanish and French data, and they are the worst case in Europe. So very fair to compare. And I looked at the last 5 weeks of rising mortality and projected it out for UK. And you can expect in the next 6 weeks, possibly a seasonal rise. But again, there's no possible justification to be applying lockdown type measures when we know they didn't really do a whole lot in the real deal. And now we're applying them when there isn't really a major deal. With due respect to the people who will die in the coming weeks, it's very sad. But let's be honest, 1 per million per day, it doesn't compute.
It doesn't indeed. And that's, of course, like a red rag to a bull for the conspiracy theorists, the 5G Bill Gates crowd. I can't sign up to their views, Ivor, but it does make you wonder why governments won't change course. Is what we're seeing here face saving and political expediency, that ultimately the country was taken on a financially ruinous course of action that hasn't really stopped the virus, and now that they've come this far, they can't turn back?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a strong element of that with the more knowing members of academia and the government leadership. I think that, given the realities, that to now kind of not lock down and not do much and potentially head into a relatively normal winter with increasing respiratory and ICU loading, but no major issue, it may cause a lot of questions to be asked, because it may look like what it kind of is a seasonal virus that was quite severe in its first passing and then passed during the summer. And it calls into question why we spent 4 months of the summer with mandatory masks and all kinds of measures. It asks a lot of questions. Whereas if you now put in lockdown and measures and the winter turns out relatively normal, you can say, well, it's because we put in those lockdowns and measures. So it's completely circular and it makes no sense, but it is a cover, if you will.
I wonder if there's a nightmare scenario, which you hint at in this explanatory video that's been on YouTube, that's had 1.5 million views. The nightmare scenario is that we are actually interfering with nature by locking down, and that we might have a worse winter because of the measures earlier in the year, unlike, wait for it, Sweden.
Yeah, now that was quite provocative, and I did it knowingly. Some people questioned and said, but you say lockdown is ineffective, but then you say that lockdown and masks might have an effect, i.e. the one you described, Mark. But the thing is, those two ideas can coexist. So lockdowns and masks are relatively very ineffective and have a dreadful cost benefit, so forget about it. But on the other hand, they may have some effect, and that effect may be just in a generally negative sense, because what has happened for all of evolution is during the summer, when immune system function is high, and sadly the susceptible have passed, you're in a safe zone where the virus could circulate with very little impact.
It's a better time in August for COVID-19 to be going around, and it's a better time to get it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would be the science, if you will. And then you would get more immunity built up in the population, and that would better protect grandfather and grandmother in the coming winter. That would be the sensible thing. But to suppress in the summer makes no sense. And I gave the examples of Cornwall in England, where around 2 million people flooded in there for around 3 months, incredible numbers. And basically they had 0 COVID deaths and no ICU action for the whole 3 months. And Devon and other areas were similar. And that just demonstrates clearly that, during the summer was the safe period for spread. But we haven't done that.
Well, what we've done is it interfered with that. And it's pretty much the first time in history that we've tried to stop the world to fight a virus, isn't it? This is seriously uncharted territory.